Okay, so I would like to welcome you all to our second APCG online colloquium today, February 19, 2021, on behalf of my colleagues Amanda, Alicia, and Justine. And we're happy that you have taken time off your busy schedules to join us today. So today um, we have Victor Agboga, who is a PhD student in the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Warwick. And he's going to be presenting his paper in Sickness and in Health, Politics of Presidential Illness and Intra-party Factions in Africa. I think it's kind of an interesting topic, and we are looking forward to hearing you. So we will give Victor 5 minutes, about 5 minutes, to sort of give us his pitch on the paper, what he expects from us during the discussion session. And then we will give our discussants today 10 to 15 minutes each to give us the review of the paper. So we have two people today who volunteered to give Victor comments on his paper. We have Dr. Annie Meng, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. Annie studies authoritarian politics, institutions, and elite power sharing. And then we have Josef Woldense, who is also an assistant professor at the Department of African American and African Studies in the University of Minnesota. So I will give Victor 5 minutes to say something briefly about his paper, and then I will turn over to Annie and Joseph. So Victor.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
That's good. As I was rightly introduced, I'm a PhD student at Warwick at the Department of Politics and International Studies. So in this paper, which I intend to publish as a journal article, so I hope to get feedback from you, at least to make the peer review process a little bit more manageable. Yes, the major arguments quickly for the 5 minutes I was given. So the first point I tried to make in this paper is that when the president is sick, it's a big deal both for developed democracies or developing democracies because it shocks the system, especially if it's a serious illness and that incapacitates the president. So it's both a serious episode for both new and old democracies. But for upcoming democracies like that, like those in sub-Saharan Africa, the issue is that we have our own unique ways. Okay, I must say this, I'm also a Nigerian, to state my positionality already. So I'm a Nigerian, and we have our unique ways of power sharing mechanisms or distributive mechanisms, redistributive mechanisms in Africa and Nigeria in particular. And the concepts of zoning and rotational presidency is actually out there. So zoning, distributing political positions according to different ethnic or religious identity groups in the country. So probably Christian, Muslim, North, South, and things like that. And rotational presidency, about turn taking. Somebody from the North takes it this term. After he finishes his tenure, somebody from the South takes it. And these are, I must say, informal or semi-formal arrangements with no necessary constitutional backing. So this is a gentleman agreement I made mention of in my paper. So when the president is sick, there is a disruption in this agreement, and because no provision is made for these unforeseen circumstances, it becomes problematic on what will happen if the president is not able to leave work for his full tenure. So a 4 years or 8 year tenure, if it's re-elected, what happens if a sickness or death cuts it short? What happens to the redistributive mechanism? So I go to Nigeria case study and how this happened twice actually. First in the tenure of President Yaradua, who actually died in office, and the national tension that happened when he was actually taken abroad for treatment, how the vice president was at the eye of the storm because it's from a different ethnic group is from the South and Christian, while the president who was taken abroad for treatment was Muslim and from the North. So there was this plot to actually perpetuate a Sikh president in order not to lead to a premature power shift to the South. But after 3 months, the president actually died and the Southerner took power, but had a very rocky presidency because people felt shortchanged, that it wasn't the turn of the South to take power. So I think I should go straight to my concluding argument that I went out on a limb here. I know it's not a very intellectual thing to do, but to defend the power sharing deal, that's this rotational presidency, as the practical option, actually. So I might argue whether it's for the long term or for the short term, or whether we should be looking for more initiatives for integral approaches to sharing power. But I go out on a limb to say the more practical approach actually has been working for a while, but it lacks this teeth, this institutional backing, and it lacks provision for what happens when these unforeseen circumstances like sickness and incapacitation happens. And I gave like a brief policy recommendation of what could be done about it, like coming together to discuss actually what happens when there's a disruption in the power rotation, and how the power should actually be rotated actually in countries like Nigeria, where the North and the South are not necessarily the same. So in the South, you have like 3 or 4 major ethnic groups. And in the North, they are a little bit more homogeneous. So if you're rotating to the South, which group actually are you rotating to in the South? Is it the Igbos or the Yorubas that are actually powerful groups in the South? So if you're saying South presidency, is it an Igbo person, a Yoruba person, or somebody from actually the Niger Delta as well? So that's the point I was trying to bring up in this paper. And I'll be happy to get your feedback and suggestions. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Joseph and Anne, do any of you prefer going first? I mean, I had Anne first and Joseph, but any of you can start.
I'm ready to start, but also if Joseph wants to go first, I'm totally fine with that too.
Okay, let's go with Annie.
Okay, awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much. It's always super fun to be with this group, so I'm happy to be with you all this morning. Thanks so much for giving me the chance to read Victor's awesome paper. I love it. I love thinking and talking about leadership succession, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm always so excited when other folks, also kind of are thinking about this really important topic that for some reason doesn't get enough attention. So I'm super excited about your paper, Victor, and I can't wait to see it published. So this was also just like a super fun read, and I love that you included all these like really fun nitty-gritty details over the succession drama in Nigeria. So I loved it. So I think what I'm going to do is I'll kind of start big and go smaller. I'll kind of, so my kind of initial comments are maybe thinking about kind of the general framing and kind of like presentation of the paper. I'll kind of have some thoughts about the theory and then kind of get smaller and kind of have some suggestions about cases and stuff like that. Okay, so kind of starting a little bit bigger and kind of thinking about the general framing and general premise of this paper. So, a point that you really kind of highlight a lot in the paper right now is that, this period of leadership succession is a really fraught and dangerous time for the country, which I totally agree with, right? And in a way, that's what makes succession such a fascinating topic to think about. My one suggestion about the general framing right now is that I think that the paper currently spends a ton of time convincing us that transition periods are highly unstable and dangerous, which I totally agree with. But I think it maybe would help to maybe highlight a little bit more and develop the theoretical argument a little bit more and kind of spend a little bit more time fleshing out things like, what are the conditions that make this dangerous period more or less conflictual? And I think that maybe, in kind of revising the paper for publication, I think maybe kind of like thinking through the different conditionalities and scope conditions for the theory, I think would kind of bring it up a notch. So keeping that in mind, here are some thoughts that I had just kind of like trying to think through the theory. So right now, the paper is arguing, or at least this was kind of my read of the theoretical argument, that so in countries with power sharing agreements, so either implicit or explicit, presidents and vice presidents are often from different factions because of these power sharing agreements, right? And so, in the Nigerian case, this is kind of like proxy via from different ethnic groups, right? So in countries where ethnic tensions are high, succession will then be conflictual, especially if these power sharing agreements are maybe like written on paper, but not truly institutionalized. And then in countries without ethnic tensions, succession will be kind of less conflictual. Okay, so in trying to kind of think through this argument a little bit more, so my first question that I had in my head is, but in countries with in countries without ethnic tensions in the first place, would we have seen the same power sharing agreements drawn up between the president and the vice president, right? So, the fact that there needed to be this kind of either explicit or implicit agreement indicates to me that, elites saw that they needed to institutionalize some form of agreement, otherwise you would have conflict, right? But would we see the same types of institutional arrangements if there wasn't this kind of existing tension to begin with, right? A lot of my work kind of thinks about how institutional constraints and power sharing emerges. And so I always really like to think about the kind of endogenous creation of institutions, right? So basically, in countries without ethnic tensions in the first place, what would the starting point of institutions have looked like? Right? So that was kind of the first thing that I was trying to think through. So the second thing that I was trying to think through was, okay, so let's think through the kind of mechanism of the theory here. So the paper argues that, a sentence that I jotted down is the paper states a gravely ill president fuels tension of imminent political instability even when there are clear processes of succession in place. Why is that the case? The paper argues that it's because there is this fear of a coup. Kind of very much connected to my first question of just kind of like how these institutions emerge. So just kind of like a potential counter argument here is that, so even if a rival faction were to take power upon the transition, wouldn't they know that there is this kind of danger of a coup, and wouldn't they then implement a power sharing agreement to ward off coups, right? Actors in general are very good at being strategic and like thinking through the potential challenges they face. Related to the first point, the risk of a coup is the very reason why the president and the VP were from different factions to begin with, right? So, in trying to think through how these actors would be strategic during the transition, my question here is, why wouldn't the rival faction taking power put in place these coup-proofing mechanisms, right? My next question is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the institutionalization of the power sharing agreement, what would that actually look like, both in theory and in Nigeria, right? Like, what levels of institutionalization could have prevented the conflict that we saw, right? And so one thing that kind of led me to think about this is that, honestly, like, the fact that there were constitutional rules that mentioned power sharing indicates that we actually did have some levels of institutionalization, right? I think that calling it a gentleman's agreement maybe kind of downplays the fact that there were written rules about this, which is definitely not the case in all African countries, right? Like this, this type of power sharing is actually not super institutionalized and is not written into the Constitution in a lot of cases. And so the fact that there is some mention of it on paper, it tells me that it's actually probably somewhat institutionalized. So, I'm just trying to get a sense of kind of like what more could have been done to prevent conflict. I think the other thing that I was trying to think through is it's interesting to think through what a counterfactual might have looked like. So if there hadn't been power sharing rules in place, what would the outcome have looked like in Nigeria? right? Let's say the president and the vice president were from the same faction, or they were from the same ethnic group. What would the successor have done, right? My sense is that I think the successor still would have wanted to be the next president. And there still might have been competition in place over the transition, right? Like these succession periods are just kind of inherently a bit competitive. And I think it would be helpful to think about just like, what if they were from the same ethnic group, right? I think that we sometimes make this assumption that co-ethnics don't compete with each other. And I don't necessarily think that that's true, right? Co-ethnic coups are definitely a thing. And in fact, you're actually more likely to be overthrown by a co-ethnic than from someone in a different ethnic group, right? And so I think that this assumption that we only get tension or competition across ethnicities is maybe something that we need to re-examine, right? Another thing that I think might be helpful in kind of trying to think through counterfactuals and trying to think about the kind of structure of case studies here is, so, you present a case with ethnic tensions. I think it would be helpful to either include a case or maybe just kind of think through a case without ethnic tensions, but with power sharing within between the president and the vice president, right? And so, just kind of like, because you kind of highlight these two important conditions, right? We want to think about whether there's ethnic tensions, and then we want to think about what the power sharing agreements look like. So just kind of like thinking about the different combinations or the absence or presence of each of these factors, and think through whether succession is less conflictual given each of these possible combinations. So another kind of thought on cases here. So just to play devil's advocate for a second, I was thinking about cases where ethnicity was really salient. So, thinking about Kenya and thinking about the first transition from Kenyatta to Moi, that's an interesting case, right? Because it's a case where there was this power sharing agreement, right? They were from two different ethnic groups, and ethnicity is highly salient in Kenya. But the constitutional succession did occur peacefully, right? What's interesting there is that, it occurred after Kenyatta died. So something maybe to think through is there a difference between, if the president's sickness happens over a long period, and then warring factions get to kind of like really get a sense of the end game, right? Versus if the president were to die maybe a little bit more suddenly, right? So is like the sickness period really what's kind of generating a lot of conflict here? So my last couple of comments are just maybe like a little bit more minor. I think it would be helpful to maybe more explicitly clarify some scope conditions. So I was wondering if your theory mainly applies to countries after the introduction of multi-party elections, or if your theory also holds during the more authoritarian periods, right? So my main thought here is, do the different factions or opposition parties actually pose a somewhat realistic threat to the incumbent at the ballot box, or is it coups that is posing more of a threat here, right? Because if we're focusing on the post-1990s period, then the nature of the threat changes, right? So if we're thinking about the Cold War period, coups were the main thing that the incumbents are worried about, right? So most of their actions there were all about coup proofing. If we're thinking about the post-1990s period, incumbents now have to balance this threat of coups also against this threat posed by kind of outside groups. And so they also have to think about kind of co-opting opposition now. The nature of the threat changes depending on the time period. And so I think it just would be maybe a little helpful to kind of clarify that. The other thing that I was wondering about is whether you're only looking at cases with explicit constitutional succession rules, right? Like, is it actually written into the Constitution that the vice president is the designated successor if the president were to die or be incapacitated? Or are you also considering cases without formal constitutional succession rules, but there is a vice president appointed and there's this kind of informal power sharing agreement there? The reason why I think it would be helpful to, thanks for your heads up, George. I'm almost done. The reason why I think it would be helpful to specify this is because we do have some existing research that argues that places with formal constitutional succession rules, especially when the VP is the designated successor, they're shown to be significantly more likely to have peaceful transitions, right? And so it would help to know whether you're kind of already looking at the subset of more kind of institutionalized, more peaceful cases, and you're trying to parse out whether you have more or less conflict within this subset or whether you're looking at this broader subset of cases. My last question for you is, I think it would be helpful to kind of be a little bit more explicit about how the DB is measured, right? So the kind of general outcome you're interested in is whether there's succession conflict. But it would help to specify what level of conflict you're looking at, right? Like, so there wasn't actually a coup in Nigeria during this period that you looked at, right? Like the fact that succession actually did happen peacefully, even though there was competition over it. I mean, that's actually doing better than most cases, especially in dictatorships, right? Like a lot of dictatorships just like are not able to pull off peaceful succession at all. And so I think it would be helpful to just be a little bit more explicit about how the DB is measured. I had a couple of citations that might be helpful for you, so I'll just drop them in the chat box right now in case anybody else is interested too. But thanks so much for writing this awesome paper and giving me the chance to talk about it. I loved it, and yeah, I'm happy for excited for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. Joseph?
Sure. I can go ahead. Yeah, no, I very much echo everything that Annie was saying. Actually, it almost feels like I may have deliberated with her. We coordinated in some ways, but we didn't. But it really does fall in place really nicely. I very much agree with everything she says, from the underlying assumption about ethnicity and sort of implying that there's harmony when we have the same ethnicity, rather than competition there being, throughout, to the broader point, and that's what I'm really going to pick up on here. And that is, number one, I think your interest in this particular moment of presidential illness as a phenomenon worth studying, I think you're spot on. I think you're really onto something. And that I would very much encourage you to continue doing. And obviously Annie's is her work that Annie's doing on succession and this institutionalization, I think really would be worth it for you to read, engage more deeply in. Right? So on that end, I think absolutely you're spot on. The challenge, I think, especially in the way the manuscript is written right now, is that to me, it's hard to actually identify an argument that you're presenting. Sort of, when I mean an argument, I mean an argument that runs through from the introduction all the way to the actual case studies to the conclusion. Right? You're presenting various ideas, but I don't think that they're coming together into an argument. And that's nothing unique, as we all know, that as you're trying to deal with the data you have, trying to think through it, right? It's always a challenge to really identify really what you're trying to get at, what you're trying to argue. But nonetheless, I think that relative absence of an argument shows up in both the structure of the paper and then the way you end up dealing with or covering the actual case studies. Okay, and so in service of that, hopefully to sort of help you think through this a little bit, I thought to myself, maybe one good exercise at the stage that you're at is to try to sort of flush out or identify the audience that you're trying to speak to. Okay, because that audience is going to ultimately determine the kind of argument you're going to be advancing. And so for that, I'm going to just share my screen really quick. Just have a couple of slides to sort of walk us through this. Sorry, let me just get this. All right. So, so what am I thinking? So when I was reading your paper, I was trying to identify, okay, what are the different audiences and what are the different questions that are associated with those audiences? And I'm just going to list them here and then sort of speak through the different kind of arguments that they would require in the different sort of structuring of your paper. Okay. So the first one would be can Nigeria's gentleman agreement survive presidential illness given that it is not institutionalized? Okay. Now, Annie obviously has already pushed back on it's actually more institutionalized than you sort of present, right? And in fact, it even shows in your case studies. But nonetheless, if this is the question, right? So then what is the audience? So who's the audience that you're speaking to? Well, that's an audience to me that currently sort of takes for granted the stability and the robustness of this moving from north-south, switching the heads of states, right? And if that's the case, if that's the audience you're speaking to, someone who thinks, oh, we're good to go, right? Your paper is sort of a cautionary tale that you're highlighting and saying, folks, we can't be as confident as we are. In fact, it's more fragile. I'm going to show you through my case studies just how fragile it is, right? Because we haven't really appreciated it, right? Now that in turn, you can imagine changes even the theory part of your paper, right? You'll be spending less time on this idea of multi-ethnic coalitions and sort of the dangers and things of that nature, but really you would be spending your time at articulating, finding sources, claims about the robustness of this gentleman agreement. I'm just going to continue calling it that, right? To really have that as the sort of the status quo, and then you so to speak would be undermining it by way of your argument and your empirics that you're showing, right? Now that's quite different paper, right? But that's one. The other one would be something that Annie has already highlighted as well, and that is, why do some coalitions turn on each other while others remain relatively intact in the wake of presidential illness? Okay. Now here, that audience is an audience that really doesn't care about the gentleman's agreement per se, perhaps even doesn't care about Nigeria. But here, presidential illness becomes a useful analytic research design to study coalition behavior, right? So in this case, it's Nigeria, and what you're studying is an entry point, just really a research design where you can say to people, look, we have ignored this particular moment of presidential illness that really gives us some purchase on understanding coalition behavior. Right? Now, if that's the route you're going, again, your argument changes, then it behooves on you to think through, well, right, I need, at least on my dependent variable, right, I want to think through both cases where coalitions turn on each other and cases where they don't turn on each other. And what do I mean even by turning on each other? And what do I mean that they're harmonious, right? Because I have a hard time in this case, and as Annie was pointing out as well, imagining what harmony looks like. Right? I'm thinking even with here in the U.S. with Trump, right, where his vice president, right, the mob is calling for his head, and the president doesn't say anything, right? And so in that respect, I have trouble thinking through what does this harmonious relationship between president and vice president look like that you have in mind, right? So that's a second audience and different paper. The third one would be this, although acting as one, just how far apart are coalition partners when they are able to express the differences? So by this, I mean, there's sort of like this, it's a presidential illness becomes a research design feature. And by that, I mean, right, when we have these coalitions, right, we see there's some apportionment of ministerial seats, and whatever, there's power sharing, but we rarely beyond that get to see how would the junior coalition partner would have acted if they would have had the opportunity to be the major or the senior coalition partner, right? We don't get to see that, right? And so in this case, it's almost as though you're trying to leverage what you have in Nigeria with Goodluck Jonathan as in some ways a counterfactual, right? It's like we don't know what Goodluck Jonathan would have done, or his faction, as you're saying, right? But then with presidential illness, we suddenly get to see what otherwise would have been hidden. Now we see that behavior expressed, the divergence in this case, right? Does he diverge from the president in terms of policy, in terms of who he wants to have in power, in positions of power, and such, right? So, so the big point being, and I think you can continue with this exercise, right? And identify different kinds of audiences with different kinds of questions. But the point really for me is that I think you need to choose one. I think right now your paper suffers from not having chosen an audience. And it shows because at some sections, you talk about the general agreement that speaks as though to like the audience of number one, right? This is an audience that takes the general agreement as for granted and doesn't see it as being under threat, as you would be arguing. But nonetheless, so my point really being, I think it's worthwhile for you to go through this exercise and then choose one and then really make sure that your paper reflects that audience, the argument that you're making to that audience from the beginning to the end. Okay, so that's the big point. The second, just to highlight in terms of the richness of the case that you're presenting, right? And as I was following it, just to kind of give you a reflection of what I saw and the kinds of questions that would come up in my head and why I think this is sort of richer than perhaps even the way that you're currently portraying it, right? And for the sake of just visual simplicity, I've on the bottom row is the political, the folks from the South, and then at the top is the top row is people from the North, right? And the way you walk us through it is that we have these different folks with different ethnicities, but just looking at their party, the party ID, right? The majority of the folks that you're speaking to, they're all in the same party. And whether you're North or South, right, they're from the same party and they're competing with each other, right? So in your story, we start with Obasanjo, right, who interestingly has his vice president from the North. And as you point out, that it's actually his own vice president who prevents him from, sort of doing this extra constitutional term, the third term. Right? And what's interesting here is that, in fact, you may say that the institution did exactly what it's supposed to do, right? That the vice president is halting a form of a power grab by the incumbent, even though he's of the same party, even though he has a lot to lose, right? And as you just point out, in fact, Obasanjo, in sort of retaliation, then turns to another Northerner that he now endorses, right? Yar'Adua, right? And so this to me is just like, that's internal politics here. That makes sense. He's spiteful, whatever it may be, right? But okay. And the former vice president sort of falls out of the picture, even though I know just from looking him up, he kept running for office, switching parties, and then returning back to that party, right, in the last election. So he's still very much present, right? But nonetheless, after he brings in Yar'Adua, he wins the elections, he then brings in the Southerner as his vice president, right? And then the story starts in the way that you portrayed with the sickness, right? But even during that sickness, it doesn't seem like Jonathan was sort of staging a coup as such, right? That, as you put it, is a sort of moment of disarray, of uncertainty, right? And so Goodluck, as the vice president, sort of asserts that position that he's in. And in fact, even then, we after we don't hear anything from Yar'Adua and his faction, as you say, right? Then suddenly Obasanjo comes from the back seats and sort of switches from his initial from Yar'Adua to then saying, okay, in fact, Goodluck should take over, right? So now all of a sudden it's like, Obasanjo to me is just someone he's endorsing one Northerner over another Northerner, but then didn't actually initially endorse Jonathan, right? Goodluck Jonathan. That ethnic logic that you would be proposing would have suggested that Obasanjo would have straight gone to Goodluck Jonathan and skipped over Yar'Adua completely, right? And not just that in fact, Obasanjo would have been one of the very first people, the moment that it was clear that Yar'Adua was sick, that he would have touted Goodluck Jonathan. But the way that you discuss it, Obasanjo it took a long time and it caught people by surprise, right? That in fact, he was upholding this arrangement that was there. And then the interesting thing here is, even after Goodluck takes over, right? I mean, when Yar'Adua, before he passes away, that when Yar'Adua comes back, he actually doesn't dismiss his vice president. He doesn't dismiss Goodluck Jonathan, right? And that's something that we see after when Goodluck loses the election, and then we see a switch in the party, right? And again, we get this presidential illness, as you point out, right? And this time we have a vice president from the South, Osinbajo, And again, we get that same scenario, but I don't see the vice president as sort of, it's not a hostile takeover. It's an attempt to, right, perform the duties of a vice president who now is called into action. And interestingly, here again, when Buhari comes back and asserts himself, he doesn't dismiss the vice president, right? And so in that sense, do I see power struggles? Absolutely. Do I see competition? Absolutely. But I would expect that anywhere, right? And so the ethnic dimension to me it's unclear, especially when you're starting to bring in that north-south is a very crude way of distinguishing in Nigeria. And within those categories, you have a multiplicity of other categories. Right? So that's to say, it's the kinds of questions that Annie was raising about these counterfactuals. What do you think about, what does harmony mean? What does contestation mean? Right? What about this here is exceptional? What about this, in fact, is sort of a success story about this arrangement that these political actors, despite competing with each other, recognizing this need to switch back and forth. Okay. So with that, let me stop.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Anne and Joseph, for those very detailed and very well thought out comments. Victor, I will give you just a minute or two to respond because we have a lot of people here, and I'm sure they all might have like comments for you as well. So just briefly, if you have any reactions to the comments, and then we will take others from the audience. So please, if you have comments, use the raise hand button, and I will start taking names. Thank you. So Victor.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments. They're very useful, I think. And they've given me a whole new perspective on how to look at the arguments and the paper in general. So I've taken lots of notes, actually. And I don't think I really have anything specific to say, apart from the fact that I think you guys did a very good job in pointing out the issues of the paper and how to improve it. I think Annie mentioned something about the presence of a kind of institutional arrangement already that is probably not perfect, but is already there. And I would like to say to that the provision of the Constitution about sharing positions among ethnic groups is particularly for like the civil service or for ministerial appointments, not necessarily for choosing political candidates for parties. But I think this is like a step down. Parties decided to like draw inspiration from the Constitution, that after all, the Constitution mandates distribution of positions among ethnic groups. And the Constitution also mandates inter-ethnic coalitions in parties. So they banned mono-ethnic parties and pushed for multi-ethnic collaborations. So that's why you get lots of people from different places, different religious groups in the same party, as Joseph pointed out. So I think I argued in that paper that we could push this a little bit further, that the Constitution already recognizes the need to redistribute positions. And we could always use this to like set the foundation to institutionalize this gentleman agreement, because it still remains a gentleman agreement because it cannot be challenged in court, for instance. If someone feels shortchanged, cannot go to court to challenge it because the Constitution doesn't explicitly recognize a distribution of positions in political parties. And that's what I feel. And yeah, that's just my comments. Thank you very much.
Great. Natalie?
So I think my reading of the paper and sort of the comments that I have really echo what Annie and Joseph already said. And in particular, I think I'd like to add a fourth option to Joseph's three excellent options for an audience, or a way to sort of shift the framing of this paper, because I really enjoyed this paper. I thought the great strength of it was the case analysis. It was incredibly well written. It was clear. There was good analysis, but also you balanced analysis with details. And I just really enjoyed that part of the paper. And I found it a little bit incongruous with the framing of the paper, which was strongly comparative. So the front end of the paper is really framing this as sort of not a comparative analysis, but a theory that should apply to many, many cases. But then there's not a lot of work put into as Annie mentioned, scope conditions and mechanisms and ways that this might differ in different places. And so what I sort of thought might work, or an option that you might think of as reframing the paper, is instead of making this so strongly comparative at the beginning, to really make this a paper about Nigeria's unique experience with these successions. And so one way that you might do that is that I found the end of the paper where you discuss different power sharing arrangements, and you make this strong claim that there should be these power sharing arrangements and that we shouldn't get rid of them, to be a bit controversial, a bit interesting, but ultimately a bit underdeveloped. I really would have loved to see much more put into that section, and to maybe move it into the front end and make an argument, make that your argument, to think about and to place your paper more strongly into the power sharing literature, how power sharing arrangements work in other cases, the extent to which they're unsuccessful or successful, and how that would be uniquely applied to this case in Nigeria. And so I thought that might be another option, and specifically, as Joseph and Annie both mentioned, to use these counterfactuals throughout your paper to push what would have happened if there had been no power sharing, if there had been no gentleman's agreement. What might we expect to have happened if this was a different period of time, or if there had been a different type of power sharing agreement? So perhaps instead of between just two groups, north-south, if there were, split out into 4 ethnic groups, how might this have played out differently? And to sort of use these different possible power sharing arrangements, or the lack of a power sharing arrangement, to drive your analysis through this case study, which again, I think is so well written and illuminating and thoughtful. So that's just one suggestion of how to maybe deal with some of these comments that Annie and Joseph raised in reframing the paper to be more effective with what you're really trying to say about these power sharing agreements. But overall, I really enjoyed the paper.
Alex?
Yeah, I think what I'm is kind of be doubling down on what Natalie said, various discussants have said kind of over the course of this. I really enjoyed the paper as well. But I think what Natalie struck on is something interesting. Like I also felt like I had kind of been given a comparative case study in the introduction and the framing of the paper, especially there's a paragraph at the end of page 3 where you do kind of make a kind of more something that leads the reader to think that they're going to get a paired comparison, right? In countries with higher regional or ethnic cleavages, you will see more of a tug of war, but in countries with lesser ethnic tensions, there will be a sort of de-dramatization of these things. And so you sort of go into it thinking that, and then that never really comes in because you're just focusing on Nigeria. And so I think it kind of also, this sort of commitment is wedding you to kind of the arguments around ethnicity, because when you're talking about the Nigerian case, as people have mentioned kind of throughout the comments, you're talking about these intricate kind of coalitional battles, and ethnicity is almost serving as a proxy for some other thing that you're talking about, whether it's neo-patrimonialism, whether it's something like that, which again kind of comes up earlier in the paper, this idea that kind of clientelism and patronage are really driving things, and then kind of goes away and you replace it with what seems like a rough proxy. And as I think kind of Annie was pointing out, you can go into a bunch of other countries where there will be kind of co-ethnics who are doing the same thing, right? Like think about Zimbabwe, right? Had Mugabe stayed around in office long enough, the fact that most of the competitors for his office would have shared the same ethnicity wouldn't have stopped a massive tug of war that probably would have been much, much messier than what we're seeing in Nigeria. And then it gets into the whole endogenous institution thing that she also brought up. But yeah, I think that if you kind of start from the case material that you have and then work out what the angle is, I think that's probably the best way to do it, because I think everyone's right that you've got some really interesting analysis in there.
Jeff? Did you want to have?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys just refreshed my memory. Actually, it was meant to be a comparative paper. I had this idea of comparing Ghana and Nigeria, but I felt after reading Ghana, it lacked the drama I found in Nigeria. So I downloaded a number of articles, and I talked to a number of Ghanaian scholars. So they sent me a number of things about Ghanaian factions. But when I read them, I was like, should I really compare this with the Nigerian case? Because when Atta Mills was sick, Mahama took things very smoothly. And then I was like, okay. But I had lots of things to say about Nigeria. But in spite of my reading of Ghana, we didn't see this antagonism and this fight. So like, would it be lopsided to compare both cases? So I decided, okay, let me just stick with Nigeria for now, since nothing serious really happened during Atta Mills' sickness. But that was just, that's just me thinking aloud.
Jeff?
Hi, I want to echo what everybody else has already said about this being a really enjoyable paper to read, mainly because there's like just so much intrigue in it, and I learned a lot from it. Even thinking I knew all the details of it, but oh my God, I did not. And I thought that was it was just a nice hook to it. And I want to sort of echo too what Joseph said as well. I don't know if this is part of a bigger, like a research project, research program that you're working on, but like the topic of presidential illness strikes me as, in African context, strikes me as really interesting, because you highlight all these cases throughout the paper about cases of presidents sort of hiding their illness and the population kind of whispering about it. So it's kind of like everybody seems to know, but nobody's willing to say anything. And I've always kind of wondered why that's the case. Is it because of like some kind of, you're afraid of a coup, so you don't want to show any weakness? Or in other times you hint that it's like trying to present this sort of the old idea of like the strong, invincible kind of father figure, and so he can't show any kind of illness. But we don't really have any empirical evidence, like, I think either way. So I'm just like laying that out there as an interesting project, but, or set of projects. But I want to echo what everybody said before about like, you know, the sort of tensions of like, what is this paper really want to be about? And I would probably also sort of lean more towards the sort of focusing on the Nigeria story more and fleshing that out. But what I wanted to focus on is kind of, and Natalie was getting at this a bit with her comments about sort of how do we think about this moving forward? Because I agree on the one hand, like the points that Joseph and Annie were making, that if you look at this in one way, it seems like, yeah, everything kind of did still work, right? It's the system didn't fall apart. There wasn't a coup. Yes, you had messy and violent elections, but Nigeria's had quite a few of those. So, you know, what went wrong about this? But then I'm thinking about moving forward, I would be interested in knowing, given all the controversies over what happens, right, were there discussions amongst elites or amongst opinion leaders in Nigeria about, do we need to change these institutions? Has there been a rethinking about this gentleman's agreement? And I didn't really get a sense of whether that has been something discussed and what kind of proposals, if it has been discussed, have been put forward. And then I would be interested in your weighing in more explicitly, and I think Alex was getting at this a bit, like about like the different paths forward. You conclude in the conclusion by sort of saying, arguing that there needs to be sort of more a formalization of like provisions for what happens if there is a illness, incapacitation, or death, and you have this kind of power sharing agreement. But I was very much wondering how you would propose going about doing that, right? Because if you do have a president from one region and a vice president from the other, and the president dies, how do you can't bring in a new vice president, right, from the same region? Would this lead to then non-power sharing between presidents and vice presidents, right? Would you have to say they have to be from the same region, and then we'll alternate between regions? But people might not like that, right? Voters might like the idea, and elites might like the idea of, at least if we have a vice president from our region, that will give us some opportunity to get access to, you know, goodies and things like that. So I had a lot of questions about like how, if you were going to formalize this, how would that spin out into different scenarios? And maybe if we can't come up with a good formalization, maybe the kind of informal / robust institutions that Annie was talking about, maybe those are the best strategies moving forward. So those are the things that I was kind of curious about and thought you could move forward with, especially if you want to focus on that first angle that Joseph was talking about. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Lindsay?
Okay, hi. This was really enjoyable to read. Every time I read about Nigeria, I'm reminded of how fascinating it is. So thank you for bringing that into my Friday. I think in kind of echoing what various people have said, I really enjoy the case study, and in kind of recentering that and thinking through, as some of you people were saying, really thinking through exactly what the scope conditions are, what the different elements are. That kind of, for a moment, I think it could bring you into like, oh, this is a story about Nigeria. But I was, in listening to Natalie, really reminded, there's a like citation from Valerie Bunce, who talks a lot about portable insights and how she was able to use her cases from the Soviet Union and Russia to really try to understand, not necessarily a direct case comparison, but what those threads were and how they applied to other people. So I feel like that's a phrase you could throw in here as you work through the case study. And like that could help kind of drive the logic of how you're building this really kind of strong inductive logic into this broader story, which it carries beyond Ghana, beyond Algeria. It really reminds me of kind of pre-Civil War United States in a lot of ways, when the presidents and the vice presidents came from different parties, and how unstable the early US found that to be. And then kind of moving away from that point and really small minor points, I think in terms of framing in the introduction, some of the discussion of the ins and outs of the relationship between the vice president and a president can be really shortened in that introduction and then moved down later. So you can kind of get, you can tell us about the gerontocracy, what a big issue this is going to be and has been, kind of, and then move straight into this logic of the power sharing in the parties, because I think that ends up being really foundational to where you're going. And then in terms of moving forward, I was struck by Annie's point about like how this ends up being kind of a situation where people are afraid there could be a coup, but there's not. Does that mean the institutions worked? So as you put in there, I would like to hear more about how this kind of struggle kind of hobbled governments as they move forward, or if it didn't. And then is that between elites or was it between people? I remember seeing polls about how like widespread kind of disappointment with good luck. And I didn't know if that was part of like hobbling the government as you struggle to move past this kind of death and succession process, or if these kind of challenges are really only, or like primarily inter-elite. But hopefully some of that made sense, and thank you for the paper.
Thank you, Lindsay. So I have myself on the list, but I don't have any. Just to sort of re-echo some of the things that has been said already. I wondered what you are thinking of this as a case of, and if it's about this tension or transitions that take place as a result of the death of presidents. As other people have been saying, I was wondering what is the proportion of cases in Africa that has experienced, and what is what is the lay of the land? What are we talking about here? Is it something we should care about? And I think like making that big point about how this travel outside of Nigeria by drawing not even only on African cases, but cases outside of it. Might bring that point pretty well. And I think that's what Lindsay also mentioned, even in the US and other places where, can we have a, maybe a database of, where this has happened and what happened in return. And I think another point that Lindsay mentioned that I had on my list was when these tensions had happened in Nigeria, can you draw on the Afrobarometer to think about how citizens were thinking about the way power is shared in Nigeria? it might be an interesting thing to compare maybe before and after if there's data to that effect. Jeff might know. Whether during these tensions, issues about ethnic, accommodation changed before and after or something like that. I don't see that, from Joseph's thing, and I had the same reaction. There wasn't any breach really necessarily of that rotation, that gentleman's agreement, but it would seem that maybe the tension that surrounded that situation change attitudes of accommodation around ethnicity during that time. So a data like that could enrich the paper I was thinking. All right, Monte. Hopefully I got that right. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. Monty McMurtry at present in Toronto, but for the past 30 years pre-COVID, I spent my time in Africa and at present am in DR Congo under the aegis of the United Nations, USAID, et cetera, including time in Nigeria. First of all, my compliments to your presentation, because from my perspective, and I consider myself to be a practitioner, is what you're doing is advancing the palimpsest in terms of power distribution vis-a-vis the convention versus statute. And as you well know, and the more I know about Africa, the less I understand, and the more I understand, the less I know. And I'm absolutely humbled as to how little I do know. But the point is, we in the West have created the miasmic problems that is besetting Africa. Because what is interesting, and Nigeria being only one case in point, Liberia being another, in terms of how they have replicated the lineaments of power, responsibility, and most important, the prerequisites of what power is. And by rights, governance should be the service of the people, as opposed to, in a sense, from Kenya, moi, 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 more for me. And DR Congo being the exemplar. And the recent intervention right now with Shikedi, how we in the West basically have said we have a two-tier system of democracy, one for the West and one for the NIGGERs in Africa in terms of the most flawed election 2018 in Congo, of which I was involved with in terms of power distribution. And what your paper is doing, you are now beginning to advance the conversation. And if I were to leave you or the group here with anything, is to push even harder, because this is what is required in terms of seeing what the problem is in black and white in terms of documented evidence. And then how does one forge a prescription? Because in Nigeria, in terms of clans, which is ubiquitous in Africa, that the lines of boundaries are arbitrary in terms of what is ethno-African, but this is our Western atavism. And how does one, in a sense, solve the issue that Nigeria in Pacific, a land very rich in resources, but is no trickle down. And then, of course, in terms of power, and what you've used, I use this as, in a sense, as the red herring in terms of sickness, because in a sense of an African, the big man, the last anything an African big man wants to do is to say that I am weak, I am hobbled. And then the hyenas or the piranhas will come and prey on the carcass. And that is really all I'm going to say, in a sense, is be more explicit and then try to differentiate between convention, which is what is considered, but unfortunately, in Africa, we don't have what we have, say, in Canada or in Great Britain, and less so in the United States, in terms of deference, in terms of what has been done. And the courts are weak in Africa because they tend to be highly politicized. And in a sense, when they don't rule in a certain way, the justices may be removed by different means. I'll just end with that, and I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Monte. Joshua?
Yeah. Thank you.
And we have just a couple of minutes left, so just keep the comments. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. I enjoyed the paper very much, and finally we met via Twitter. I consider my suggestions quite relevant if you take it that way. I think your paper would have benefited more from giving us all the dramatic intrigues surrounding how the First Lady was actually the de facto president then. I mean, she was the one actually shielding everybody from knowing what was going on with the health of the president in Saudi Arabia, to the moment he landed in Nigeria, and how the whole shenanigans of activities affected the institution of the presidency even up to this moment, and how it exalted the office of the First Lady. I mean, we saw how the impatient Jonathan was elevated to a sort of big position, and how the current First Lady has been demoted, so to say, in the sense of having First Ladies in Nigeria. So I think your paper would have, you could have given us those, how she forged the signature for the budget and everything, to all give us the whole drama. But all in all, I enjoyed the paper, and kudos. Thanks.
Kelechi.
Hi, Victor. Nice reading your paper. I enjoyed every bit of it, and you granted me the opportunity to visit what happened in the history past. There's something I want to point out. There are three things, actually. The first one is the gentleman's agreement. Actually, the gentleman's agreement is within the PDP, and what happened in 2015 was that there was a flout in that gentleman's agreement, and that was what aided APC to come into power with Buhari. So, and currently the debate is actually about, do we continue with this gentleman's agreement within PDP? And people are saying, no, we don't want to continue with it. But there's a particular region within Nigeria that actually says, we've not had anything since we started this thing called Nigeria, that's Southeast. So we should have our own before you say we no longer want to have this agreement. So I think to some extent, you can also tease out this aspect in your paper, and then try to highlight the current debate about this gentleman's agreement that's only within the PDP. That's what I can say. Then actually Joshua touched upon something which I feel I also missed out. There's a book by Segun Adeniyi, Power, Politics and Debt. I read that book some years ago, and it actually enlightened me about what really went on when Yar'Adua was actually sick. He actually brings out some nuances about the play of politics within Aso Rock and what really actually took place. Because Josef actually talked about the fact that the vice presidents don't actually seem to fight physically or try to show that they want to take over. Actually, they don't do that, but their cronies and the people within their cabal try to instigate some things and then try to push that agenda forward. So I think you could also get some insight if you read from Adeniyi's book. The last one is about the Doctrine of Necessity. It's always in the Constitution that if there is a vacuum, the Doctrine of Necessity comes up and the vice president takes over. But what really happened at that point in time was the fact that people were strong enough to hold power and avoid that to take place. And when that thing came in power, Jonathan actually took over the reins and things went smoothly. So maybe you could also highlight a bit about what really went on, the cabal kind of debacle, and it will help your paper a lot. Kudos to you, and please keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the comment. Thank you, Victor, for giving us the opportunity to read about this very, very interesting topic, which, as you have realized, there's not much, we know about this. So you are up to something. So keep forging ahead to make it better, and we look forward to reading it. Thanks to Annie and Joseph for this very insightful comments, and to everybody for spending your afternoon with us. Next on the bill, we have Michael Yekler, who is also a PhD student from the University of Central Florida. Justine, my colleague, will be holding it, and the topic would be revisiting democratic peace theory, support for war, economic sanctions, and democracy promotion among Africans. So that will be our third APCG colloquium, and I look forward to seeing you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all very much. Thanks, Victor.
Good to see everyone.
Good to see everyone.